Thank you all for attending our class on fall and winter vegetables presented by UC Master Gardeners of El Dorado County. Our mission is to extend research-based knowledge and information on home horticulture, pest management, and sustainable landscape practices to our community. Today's class is being presented by UC Master Gardeners Zack Dowell, and your hosts are Linda Ray, myself, Cody Snyder, and Tracy C. Leo. This presentation will be about an hour and a half long. We appreciate and encourage questions, and we'll do our best to address them all at the end of the presentation and throughout the chat. This class is being recorded and will be posted on our public website after the class, along with materials and resources. We will post the link from our website in the chat. We will be emailing you a follow-up survey in about 3 months. The purpose of the survey is to find out if participants are implementing what they learned from the class. So please take a moment and fill out the survey for us. It really helps us improve our program. Okay, let's get going. I'm going to turn the class over to Zack for his introduction and presentation on growing fall and winter vegetables.
Thank you, Cody. Thank you, Linda. Thank you, Tracy. Thank you, NEMGs. Thank you, folks from the public. Thanks for coming out on a Saturday morning to talk about vegetables. My name is Zack Dowell, he, him. I am sipping coffee to warm up my throat. I've been a master gardener for some time now, and I love teaching these classes and talking to folks about, in particular, edible things that we can grow that we can eat. That's kind of what I do. Master gardeners have all kinds of expertise, and you really should avail yourself of the knowledge that there is so much knowledge in the Master Gardener program. So many great gardeners who garden in all different ways in the county and can really help you be successful in the garden in lots of different ways, not just growing food plants, but growing sort of anything that you want to put your mind and your effort into growing. And we also have, I'll plug it here, but if you haven't visited the demonstration garden up behind the El Dorado Center, it's a gem, and it's getting better every day. So I like to start by having you think about this question: how does your garden grow? Anything? Feel free to add to the chat if you've been really successful this year with something. If you're having a real particular problem, can't guarantee we can answer all the questions, but just either reflect on or put in the chat, like how does your garden grow this year? How's it going? I can tell you for myself, while you're kind of thinking of that and putting some things in the chat. Oh, I'm going to look. A good year, great. Any vegetables going off right now? For myself, recent successes have been things like, oh, I'm spacing on the name of these. What do you call fancy strawberries that are not like regular strawberries? Anyway, I'm spacing, but planted some of those, and they're smaller, but make regular strawberries sort of taste like blah. I had some walnuts, so I have a new walnut kind of little grove out in the woods, and I had some walnuts coming up this year for the first time. I replanted asparagus a couple years back. I let my beds go, and they died because of the persistent drought we had for a while, but I have since replanted a couple years back now. We'll talk a little bit. I think we talk about asparagus here. Takes a while to really get asparagus going. Volunteer tomatoes, right on. I love anything that'll volunteer in the garden, right? If you think about how difficult it can be to grow certain things in this county, anything that will grow on its own, I think we ought to absolutely encourage, as long as it's not a sort of an invasive non-native. Oh, okay, potatoes, right on. Potatoes are, thanks, Jackie. Yeah, onions are kind of a tough one. I'll talk about that. It really has to do with picking the right varieties. And one real great way to do that is get in touch with the master gardeners, or go to the demonstration garden, or call the phone lines, because folks you'll probably be able to find a gardener who, even within El Dorado County, right, there are different kind of heat and cold profiles, and there's different elevations and those kinds of things. So a lot of my garden, I did a kind of my summer garden this year. I did a a kind of a lesser version because I just got off of a 30-day hike from Denver, Colorado to Durango, Colorado on the Colorado Trail, where I saw this is sunrise from 14,422 feet, and I saw lots of animals. There's a weird section of the Colorado Trail that's a lot of domestic cows. That was not my favorite section. And I saw sheep, and I saw picas or picas. Aren't they cute? They gather bundles, right? They call it haying, but they either eat stuff or they store it in their little burrows and they bark. I saw mountain goats, which I had never seen in the wild. And I saw moose, which I hadn't seen since I was a little kid in Yellowstone. And I saw a lot of really interesting plants. So one of the cool things about the Colorado Trail is you go through sort of a whole lot of different ecosystems and kind of profiles of the way plants work. So they have, this is stonecrop, right? Sedum, whatever it is. We have some things like these in the Sierra, right? Succulents. And there were sections that were sort of high desert where there were blooming cactus. And there were incredible fields of columbine and wildflowers. And so I took a lot of pictures of plants and looked at plants. And in particular, here's your kind of little quiz. There were some, I mentioned I focus on plants that you can eat. So there were at least 3 plants all throughout the Colorado Trail that are edibles and that have kind of corresponding plants that we can plant in our gardens. If you know the answer, think in your mind, you might know the answer to these, you might not. You can shout them out to yourself. I'm interested to see, does anyone know what those are? I'm looking in the chat. Anyway, Fragaria is strawberries. So there were wild strawberries throughout the trail. Ribes are gooseberries, currants, right? So there were those. We have some of those in Sierra. They're really spiky often. And then rubus. So both thimbleberry and whatever the sort of native Colorado raspberry is. So the just bushes alight, these are gooseberries in particular, bushes alight with these kinds of things. So I like to start by having us stop and think a little bit about why we're here or why we garden. And you want to just take a minute and think about that. You can put it in the chat, like, why do you do this? Why do you could just buy vegetables from the store. So why would you go through the trouble of doing these things? So you can either just think about that. You can put that in the chat if you want to share your reasons for gardening. And I'd actually love it if you put it in the chat. I like to get a sense of what people are thinking when they're planning for gardening and dreaming about gardening and buying seeds and starting plants. And so as you're doing that, nobody? Come on, people. Why do you garden? There we go. Okay, love to cook, best for fresh eating. Fantastic. Availability, farm to table, absolutely outstanding. Things taste better. Love it, Lindsay T. The lush green makes my heart whole, right? Soul gardening is like a big part of the reason like many of us do this. Provide for the family, peace and crazy, therapy. Nice, absolutely. Carrots to feed Santa's reindeer, the outdoors, therapy. The joy of seeing things grow as a stress reliever, right? So there are as many reasons to garden as there are gardeners, and it's a practice that many of us sort of need to feel whole or to feel relief from the stresses of everyday life, or to provide for our families, or to share our produce. And for me, and you may have said this in the chat and I see it, nice grandkids coming to your pumpkin patch. I mean, that's a powerful thing for young people, right? To see where food comes from and to enjoy these things and picking vegetables. And so someone may have said this, or it might be sort of hidden in availability. But for me, a lot of it has to do with planting things that I can't get in other ways. Like I really love rare and unusual fruits and vegetables, and the challenge of that, because often these things are not really super well adapted for for El Dorado County. But so this bed is a bed I planted a couple of years ago. I got a lot of really interesting plants from the Occidental. If you've ever been to Occidental, California, there's a really fantastic permaculture center there, and they have some really unusual edibles. And so I got a bunch of them, and so these are the things that are in that bed. So mostly earth nuts and skirret and Chinese artichoke and things that you grow, similar to Jerusalem artichoke or sunchoke, where you're growing them for their subsoil structures, right? And so one of the big things that I like to do is grow plants. Here's one, myrtus. This is the main ingredient in Myrto, which is a Sardinian national liquor, and it's a cool plant that has a really aromatic leaves, sort of similar in ways to bay, the California native bay, in terms of the strength of the smell and those kinds of things, or things like Andean roots and tubers, right? So Oxalis tuberosa, which is oca. Anyone grown that? It produces these little nubbly potato-like structures that you can, use sort of akin to potatoes. And so that's one of the reasons that I garden. So I may mention some kind of unusual fruits and vegetables, and I garden also for all the reasons that y'all do. So today, just to give you a sense of what's going to happen, we're going to talk just a little bit about garden planning and management, right? If you're going to put plants in the ground, you should have some plan for it, or not. I mean, the other thing, I'll do this as an aside. Gardening isn't exactly rocket science, and so we are called master gardeners because we've been through a program. But I fail as much as I succeed, and a lot of the successful gardening just comes from a lot of unsuccessful gardening, or less than successful gardening. And so I really think of it as a long-term process and practice, and a thing that you should document and make notes about and take pictures of and think about and research and talk to master gardeners and try stuff and see if it works, and if it doesn't, try again in slightly different ways, either by siting the plant differently or choosing a different variety or changing the water or working on the soil. So we're going to talk a little bit about those kinds of things, how to prepare for this current planting season, and then talk about the specific plants that we'll be planting. I will reference many times, and then finally resources, right? So master gardeners are a great gateway for lots of resources, some of which I'll mention. They're great resources in themselves and able to answer questions or be able to find the answers. I mean, a big part of the program is knowing where to look for the right answer. So in terms of, folks mentioned the survey that's coming up. So in my day job, I'm a faculty member at Folsom Lake College, and I run a transdisciplinary innovation space there. And in my day job, we talk about outcomes. And so that's what I hope, or what we hope as master gardeners, you do or feel experience after this experience because you were here, basically. So we hope you plant or expand a vegetable garden. And in particular, I really love it, folks who are more accustomed or who have never planted multi-season gardens, right? You may be starting out as a summer gardener, right? And doing the things that you're eating now, tomatoes and those kinds of things. And so I think it's great if you then expand into planting some things now that you're going to be harvesting, for Thanksgiving or for Christmas or the holiday season or December and through the new year, and sometimes even into next summer in the case of things like alliums and stuff. So I hope you grow healthy, nutritious vegetables. And the way to do that is to, basically have good garden practices and use IPM, integrated pest management strategies, and water correctly, et cetera, et cetera. And then I hope you share your surplus. There's efforts in this county, plant a row, et cetera. So sharing, a lot of folks mentioned sharing with grandkids or kids or their families. And so I hope that you're so successful that you have buckets and bushel baskets of vegetables that you can share with folks, which I think is rather poetic. So let's just talk a little bit about, and we'll take a bio break. We'll kind of go through this stuff. We'll take a bio break and a stretch break, and then we'll come through and finish up and then do some questions and stuff. Again, if you have questions, go ahead and toss them in the chat. There are folks looking at the chat. I sometimes look at it and we'll either try to answer them now or answer them sort of at the end to the extent that we can, or point you in a direction. There's probably questions that none of us might have the answers to at the tips of our tongues, but we can kind of point you in a direction. Sound good? I'm assuming you're all shaking your head and giving me a thumbs up that that sounds good, and we're going to proceed. It's weird, you know, Zoom's weird, right? I'm accustomed to doing this in rooms full of people where I can look at your eyes, but we're going to move on. So I'm just going to mention these kind of garden practices. Many of these the master gardeners have whole classes in, right? Irrigation. We have classes in irrigation and in propagation and in, so some of these warrant, or not all of them, but many of them warrant their own class, right? And their own, hey, thank you, Jack. Sorry, I looked in the chat and someone gave me a thumbs up. These warrant their own class, right? So I'm not going to go into any great detail, but just some things to think about. And starting with location, it's a real important one, right? And location, I'm talking about in sort of a zoomed out sense of where we are in the world, and then in a zoomed in sense in your garden. So the planting guide, I'll mention this many times. I don't know if you can actually see this if I hold it up, but I'll hold it up anyway. And the planting guide, it's not going to focus on it. There's a planting guide. I have pictures of it later. It's really the best. I've used it. I use it more than any sort of gardening resource. It was developed or adapted for our county by master gardeners, some of whom I used to teach with. It tells you when to put seeds in and when you can expect to have vegetables, and it gives you a way to slip those dates. So if you it's sort of centered on Placerville, but if you live in a higher, colder area or a lower, warmer area, all that really means is you sort of can slip your dates. You can start earlier if you're lower and warmer, or you might have to start later if you're waiting for your area to warm up because you're at a higher elevation or those kinds of things. So these zones, so, and then I'll mention this a little bit, you don't get too caught up in it, but there are different ways that when you're evaluating plants to decide whether they'll work in your particular zone. Placerville is in, these are USDA garden zones 9A. So you might see that on a plan, like it might be, it works in these zones. And you might be a little higher or a little lower. And you might, because it's Zoom, you might be coming from somewhere else entirely. So most of the information that we're sharing today is about El Dorado County, but you can find ways to kind of adjust that for where you are if you're coming from far afield. I myself garden in Georgetown, upcountry Georgetown specifically, at right around 3,000 feet. So I have maybe more snow than the average Placerville garden. And so that affects when I can plant things and when I can harvest things. And you may be in a similar situation. And then Tracy posted in the chat that you can order the planting guide or pick it up. And I have several copies. I keep one by sort of one in my office at work, one here, because it's just helpful, especially if you're just getting started in multi-season gardening. It helps you to kind of understand how the seasons overlap and when you're planting and when you're harvesting. So. And those zones are just based on things like average annual extreme minimum temperature. That's usually it. On average, zone 9B, where Placerville is, the annual extreme minimum is 20 to 25. It doesn't usually get that cold, even up here in Georgetown, but sometimes it does. So you might also see Sunset Western Garden Zone. So Sunset is California Living magazine that popularized a set of zones. So you might say Sunset Zone 7 or 9 or 1A, depending where you are. I always mention this because I think it's interesting. Georgetown is in the same Sunset Western Garden Zone as Oregon's Rogue River Valley. And if you've ever been to the Rogue River Valley in Oregon, it looks like Georgetown. There's madrones and there's sort of all the same similar plant communities. You might have been transplanted to another place. So sorry. So location, that's location in the big sense, right? And then we zoom in and we think about our own gardens. And so the ideal garden spot, if you're planting in the ground, right, has, or if you're planting anywhere, right, 6 to 8 hours of sun. 8's better than 6 usually, but if you got 6, that doesn't mean you should not garden there. Ideally it's level, and that just has more to do with watering and soil and access to the garden. And in this county, gardens need to be watered. That's even true of a lot of things we're talking about today, at least in the early stages. Eventually, sometimes by Halloween, it's wet enough where you don't have to think about water anymore, but that's not always true. Seems like it used to always be true, but it's not always true anymore. And then within your garden space, you might have areas that are shadier or lower, right? And thus have cool airflow, or ways that you can kind of look at your own place to garden and decide where things might be based on like really hyper local conditions. And then accessibility, right? The best garden is one that you can get to, easily access. If you have mobility issues or issues with back problems or something, there's ways to make raised beds, right? So that you're not bending over to garden all the time. So thinking about how you use the garden and how these attributes of the location kind of lend to the best gardening. I also, as I mentioned before, I think you should take pictures of everything you do because it reminds you. So this is many, many years ago. I gardened in Georgetown in a clear cut on my property, and this is maybe a 20 years ago garden or something. My garden looks very different now. My garden's about, just to give you a sense of scale, I think it's 2,700 feet, 2,700 square feet under cultivation. Of that, about 650 square feet is annual beds. So I garden in raised beds now, after, as you can see in this photo, after for a long time gardening right in the ground. I'll talk about why, but and then the rest of it is annuity crop, things that I planted, apple tree, fruit trees of all kinds, jujubes and Asian pears and apples and et cetera, et cetera. And so many of those things are things you plant and then wait for years to get harvested. These pictures are also, I think, taking pictures of your garden, especially if you have a kind of a large garden, is great to sort of remember what I planted where. And we'll talk about kind of rotation of crops and how that's kind of a good thing. And then it also gives you a sense of how big things are, right? Corn is a huge plant. And so if you plant it when it's in full growth, it might shade other things. That might be good, that might be bad. It might be great for peppers, and it might make tomatoes angry. So timing. Timing. What I mean there is when you plant things. So today's class is talking about things that we are seeding. I'm looking at my planting guide, that we are seeding sort of now, July and August, or planting plants in July, August, and September, and then expecting to start harvesting more or less November 1st through February, March. So that's why it's fall and winter garden. It also, by the way, things that are grown in the fall or winter are often grown for their leaves and immature flowers. If you think about things like broccoli and all the cole crops and their allies. Whereas things that are grown as spring, summer vegetables are often grown for their fruiting bodies, the seed-bearing bodies, so tomatoes and peppers and beans and those kinds of things. So that's one kind of way to think about timing. This is what, if you don't have access to one of these, this is what it looks like. And so that's the spring, summer one. Do I have the fall and winter one next? I do. This is the one we're talking about now, just to give you kind of a macro view of what we're talking about. So we're in middle of August. We can be planting plants if you can get them, or if you have seeded them in a greenhouse, of lots of the cole crops, so the cruciferous vegetables, cauliflower, broccoli, cabbages, and those sorts of things. And then we would expect to harvest those starting in November for broccoli, perhaps, and into December, January for some of the other things. And then there's, if you kind of scan down the chart here, there's a real particular window in October that is a nice planting window for spinach and peas and fava beans, and in particular for me, alliums. So onions and garlic and their allies. And so we'll talk about, these are the things that we're going to be talking about when we get to that part of the thing. But timing is also about We talked, there are several, and I saw from the chat, and you may be thinking about it now, there's lots of soul gardeners out there, right, that do this because it's a renewing practice personally, or it centers them, or it gets them away from the stresses of other kinds of life, right? And so I love that, because the other thing that a garden can teach you is that it has its own timing cues, right? And so this, if you recognize this plant, this is one of the things where I know spring is coming. And this is rhubarb. Rhubarb is an early emerger in early emerger? Is emerger a word? Probably not, but it emerges early in the spring, and as does asparagus, for instance. Or those are the two that kind of come to mind where I'm like, oh, this is a sign that spring is just around the corner. That doesn't mean there still won't be some heinous snows or something crazy, but it means the plants are feeling the conditions that are like, okay, it's time to grow. Because one of the greatest things to do, I think, is just either let a plant go and volunteer. You will see that it knows when to grow and germinate, or to throw some seeds out somewhere in the side of the garden and see how they react. When do they decide to germinate? When do they come up? And it kind of tune in, if you can, to the rhythm of the garden, which has a lot to do with moisture and has a lot to do with temperature and daylight and all these things. But you can start to get a feel of like how the rhythms are working and the timing, and that can only help you, I think. And planning is super important, I guess, depending, or also, you know, you could just let a wild garden grow and the plants will do the planning for themselves, so to speak. But I like to keep records, in particular because it reminds me of my garden beds, where the tomatoes were last year and where are they going next year, and which bed do I have to leave under a cover crop until October so that the garlic can go in there. And that shouldn't be, ideally, it's not the same one it was in last year, right? Plants like what they like. They'll take from the soil what they particularly like. So heavy feeders will pull a lot of nitrogen out of the soil, for instance. And pests and disease pressures can build up in the soil if you have resistant plants, right? So if you're planting verticillium and fusarium and other kind of wilt resistant things, you know, that can eventually be problematic if you're just doing it in the same place forever. So ideally, you're moving things around, and you're also getting where they were before. If you have heavy feeders, for instance, tomatoes, following that, or corn, following that with things like beans or leguminous cover crops, so that you're adding nitrogen back to the soil. Keeping in mind, record keeping also helps you to understand the growing habits of plants. I mentioned the corn example. Like, corn is really tall, and so if it is shading out things from noon on, that can be good or bad depending on how those things work. Knowing about how perennials interact. So if you are putting in a bed of asparagus, you're not going to want to put that in the middle. This sounds obvious, but you're not going to want to put it in the middle of everything else, because the asparagus is not something that you move, right? It's going to be there for 15 years giving you asparagus, or 20 years, or however long. So knowing what the plants look like and how they kind of act over the season, and then grouping things according to irrigation or watering needs, right? We'll talk a little bit about that and why drip is the ideal way to water. But so here's just a simple, when I was growing more in rows, this was kind of a plan for my fall and winter thing. So to the right there, which in this case in my garden would be, where does the sun rise? It rises in the east. That would be the east. Asparagus bed, not mixed in with the other things, because in this instance I was tilling using a tiller, and you don't want to disturb the asparagus roots and so forth. So that's over there, and then sort of peas and chard and those kinds of things in rows, and those all have more or less similar water requirements. And then excuse me, broccoli planted lots of, because I like it, and then onions and garlic, which are out of the outside of this plot. And the reason for that is we plant garlic in October, but it's not harvested until July-ish. And that's all that other stuff would be done by there. And everything between garlic and asparagus would be up and out of the garden, and I'd be getting ready for summer planting, right? So just thinking about how long plants stay in the ground and planning around it. Here's an overhead view of my main garden area. And when I look at this, a couple of things I notice a giant oak tree shadow, right? And so that's something that I know about my garden, that before like 11 o'clock, that shadow is over much of the garden. And then for the rest of the day, it's not. The sun, in this case, is going from the right side of the screen to the left. The things at the far left or the far west of this garden are in full sun all the time. And so I know that about this garden. This is what's in this garden. You probably can't read that, but the main
Zach,
four. Yes, sorry.
I hate to interrupt you, but we can't see your pictures.
Why?
I don't know.
Wow. Okay.
Oh,
Let me stop.
oh, wait, hold on. There
Oh.
was almost a blurb there.
Let me share again and see if that helps it. Do you see
Yes.
anything? Okay.
Yeah, we can see them now. Thank you.
Thanks for, yeah, please. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely interrupt me. That would freak me out. The four kind of rectangular places in the middle are what I'm now using as annual beds, and the rest of this stuff is more or less perennial. Although that's not universally true, and I work things in between here and there. But just to give you a sense of what I grow, you know, pawpaws and Nanking cherries and quinces and Saskatoons and cornelian cherries, which are dogwoods. There are a couple of species of dogwood that will produce fruit. I mean, I guess they all do, but there's ones that are produced specifically to be eaten. And Chinese haw, which is fun. And that crab apple's going off this year. I'm excited to make some crabapple jelly. And then there's other plots in and around these and out in the forest. And alpine strawberry is the word that I was trying to think of earlier, which is different, sort of different than regular old strawberry. Did the screen move on? Are we good?
Looks great.
Outstanding, thank you. Here's an example of maybe difficult garden practice, right? So there's all the garlic. This is literally the example I was trying to share. There's garlic in the middle of everything, and I had to plow and do all the rows when I was doing row gardening around the garlic because it was just not ready to come out of the ground. So soils and fertilizer, ideally let me say this first. I really think you just think about your soil as another thing that you're growing. I'll just start with that. You can get really focused on soil analysis and soil composition and all those things, and that's great if you're into that. And otherwise, it can just be a big worry. And so what I would say is just think of your soil as something you must do something for it every year. And that might be replacing it. I mean, if you're growing in containers, eventually you might have to replace your soil, but otherwise you're either resting it or cover cropping it or adding compost or doing something and thinking about it as the life support system of all these things that you hope to grow. And so really thinking of it as a partner and as another organism that you are doing things for by mulching it so the worms come in because it cools it down, or by doing these things. And then you'll encounter fertilizer thoughts as you think about growing plants. Fertilizer, I'm an organic gardener, so the fertilizers that I choose are from organic sources, bat guano and fish emulsion and those kinds of things. And you might be that, and you might be a gardener that chooses other kinds of nitrogen, and you know, there's room for all of us here in the world. The ideal soil, it has a sort of neutral to slightly acid pH. Again, you can send soil away and have it analyzed. And I did that when I first gardened in a new plot, just to get a sense of where the baseline is, but then pretty quickly forget what it ever was and just continually add compost or composted manures or cover crops, and just think about every year, what am I doing for the soil? Fertilizer is NPK, nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. Roots, shoots, and fruits is another way to think about that. So when you get shoots, roots, and fruits, excuse me. So nitrogen is for leafy green growth, and phosphorus for roots, and potassium for fruit development. Generally speaking, it's kind of a reductionist formula, but when you buy fertilizer, you'll see on the package 3 numbers, and that's what those mean. And you don't worry too much if you're not familiar with that. If you get one that's a 333, that's a nice sort of balanced, not supercharged fertilizer. It doesn't have a whole lot. I mean, it's not like nitrogen. It's not going to burn anything. It's going to be a nice general purpose, balanced fertilizer. If you're going particularly for one of those 3 shoots, roots, and fruits, you might choose a fertilizer that's a little bit higher numbers on one or the other of those things. Mix it up in big or small quantities. Apply it to the plants during the growing season in liquid form, or side dress in solid form, or get animal manures if you have them. Rabbit manure is one of the greatest garden manures there is. So if you have access to rabbits, get some closed systems going where you're feeding the rabbits from the garden, and they're turning those vegetables back into manures for you and working those into the garden. Composting is a real great practice. If you have ducks, love to turn compost and eat bugs and fertilize it in turn. So if you have livestock, if you don't, that's fine too. You can there's sources for compost. You can do under-counter vermicomposting or worm composting. We have some of the preeminent experts in the county are worm casting and vermiculturists. So look those folks up. Compost is just a process of taking organic waste and letting them break down through various processes. You can do that in open piles on the ground. You can do it in a post hole composting way, where you just take a post hole and dig stuff through garden scraps, vegetable scraps in particular, and bury them. And eventually insects and bacterial processes and fungi and those kinds of things will break that stuff down. Or I happen to have one of these big old compost turner things. You can do that. One of the easier ways to compost in place is the concept of cover cropping. So especially, and this works in raised beds, and it works in the ground, and it works in any context, but that's a question of planting something specifically that you're just going to chop up and till back into the soil, right? And so these usually consist of legumes or leguminous plants that will do some nitrogen fixing in their roots, and then some things for roughage, usually annual grasses, and then sometimes vetch, which is also leguminous and grows like crazy. So the process is you plant it. I usually plant this by Halloween, and it grows until the winter really comes. This is just an example of nodules on the roots of leguminous plants. So these are things in the beans and peas are the most common ones, but there are other leguminous plants. And they do this magical thing where through these colonies in the roots will take nitrogen and fix it and make it plant available. It's kind of a magical process. Not magic, but a natural process. And in a cover crop, you let it grow. When the snow comes, it'll sit happily under snow and not grow and stall out. When it becomes warm again, it'll start growing like crazy several weeks before you want to plant in that area. You chop it up. The child in this photo is now like 27, and till it in and let it kind of cook down in the soil for at least 2 weeks. And so right now, for instance, and you can get crops that you plant in October, and you can get summer cover crops. Like right now, for instance, I use a lot of buckwheat. Buckwheat is a quick growing summer cover crop. So whenever I'm done with a bed, you can sneak a crop of buckwheat almost in a month. Plant some buckwheat, let it grow up, chop it up, till it in the soil, ideally before it seeds, because if you let it seed, you'll have it forever. But it's not invasive. It's really easy to pull up, so don't worry too much about it. And it's really just adding organic material to the soil. It's not leguminous, I don't think. It's just adding some roughage, so to speak, to the soil, which is just good for the soil. It opens it up, and it makes the structure better, and it makes the water retention better, and it's just a good thing. I mentioned that I used to grow in rows. My garden's in a clear cut, and I was seeing declining yields and plant health, and it really was because all the trees on all sides, right, cedars and madrones and oaks, were like, oh, loose soil with water and fertilizer, let's fill that up with roots. And so my soil became in the garden just a solid mass of roots, and I tried to do this double digging where you like dig down deep and then you use a tiller in the bottom of that and move the soil around and try and kind of lower the pan, so to speak. And eventually I just gave up because it was an arms race I wasn't going to win. And so I transitioned to raised beds, which have some other benefits. They're kind of easier to manage in some ways and easier to water. And you can screen the bottoms with hardware cloths so that the gophers don't get in, and you can kind of really micromanage, if you want, the way the soil works in a 4x8 bed or whatever the size. But as I mentioned before, just think about, I talked about fertilizer, but think about what are you doing for your soil. So feed your soil, not your plants. I mean, you can feed your plants, but really think about your soil and what are you doing for it. Irrigation, really quickly. Probably many of us do all kinds, hand watering, overhead sprinklers. I build these Frankenstein-esque manifolds so I can kind of manage water in different ways, and water in all these ways, but primarily on drip. And drip irrigation on timers is a super reliable way to manage water, and it's, you know, research based. It's the best way to do it, right? You're conserving the most water, putting the water where you want, when you want, and it's getting down to where plants need it, which is not usually, if you hand water, often you're not watering enough, and you're watering like the top inch of soil or whatever, and really plants want to have, the roots are down at the foot level or, you know, much farther down, so they really want the water where that is. I'm going to time out really quick and say, don't worry if any of this is stressing you out. Don't let it stress you out. Just go out and plant some plants and ease into all these things, because you'll never get it. In my day job, we talk about prototyping, and you're never going to get it right the first time anyway. So you might as well just do it and learn what you need to know for the next time. So just don't stress on any of that. Just plant. If you're starting seeds, that's the most economical way to get a lot of plants, and it's a great way to get plants that you can't find elsewhere, right? The big box stores and nurseries will have a certain number of varieties of tomatoes, right? And they're going to be the AAA, whatever, the AAA selections and etc. But there are thousands and thousands and thousands of varieties of tomatoes. So by starting from seed, you can find obscure catalogs and obscure web resources and start all kinds of plants that you might not otherwise find in 6-packs at the store. You can start a seed library like we have at the college in the Master Gardener office. You can find seed companies. This is not an endorsement of any particular company, but just to let you know that there are seed companies that provide seeds specific to the county and adapted to the foothills, and things that are kind of known to work really well historically, sometimes going all the way back to, you know, the mining times. Check out the Felix Gillet Institute if you're interested in historic mining trees, and it's a cool org that goes out and finds these mine orchards from, you know, the 1800s and the early 1900s and propagates those, so you can get these you can get trees growing that, you know, have been feeding families in our county and in Placer for generations.
Excuse me, Zach.
Yeah.
Natalie has a question, and it's one I've also had in the past.
Yeah.
Will you please elaborate on what fixing nitrogen actually means? What happens to the nitrogen when it's unfixed? Does it seep out of the soil?
It's a good question. So the nitrogen in its unfixed thing is atmospheric nitrogen, as I understand it. And so it's in the air, meaning it's not available to plants. So they need to absorb that through the roots. And so what the organisms that form the nodules in the roots of plants are doing are somehow, and I'm not, I don't know the scientific ways of this, but they are somehow taking that nitrogen and binding it in some way that makes it plant available in the soil. And so otherwise the nitrogen is sort of out in the air. And right, nitrogen fertilizers like lightning, right? That lightning is the only other way that does that, I think. But so really what it is it's just it's getting it from the air, as I understand it, and making it available to plants via the roots. Otherwise there isn't going to be nitrogen in your soil, I don't think, unless you're adding it in the form of nitrogenous fertilizer. Not sure that answers the question, but I'm outside it. That's sort of outside, a little bit outside of my depth. So I'll be honest about what I know and what I don't.
Thank you.
Yeah. There are lots of cool plants that nitrogen fix, things in the pea family, and even Scotch broom, the dreaded Scotch broom is a nitrod, and Kidkadizzy or bear clover, which is a native ground cover, is a nitrogenous, or it's a non-legume nitrogen fixer. But anyway, it's a fascinating topic, and I encourage you to check it out. Not to belabor the point, but to bottom line it, plant some peas and beans, and then that does the work. So if you're starting seeds, you think about the media. Soils may be a misnomer here, because you usually don't start seeds in mineral soils, but in a planting mix that often is made of different things, maybe fir bark and sand and peat moss or coconut husk. But seeds like particular temperature, water, and air to germinate. This is all on the seed packet usually, or you can kind of look up. Seeds don't really like to be soggy, right? That's one thing. So if you're starting things from seed, you don't want them drowning. They'll either rot or they just won't germinate. So you want to keep the soil evenly moist. You want light material. You can see from this picture of, these are me starting seeds of tomatoes and some herbs. That soil mix I'm using there has a ton of pumice and it has a ton of what's a not vermiculite? Perlite. Because it's light and you want lots of root growth. And seeds often need light or heat to germinate. So if you have a greenhouse or a sunny window, then that's often a good place. This greenhouse, which is a greenhouse with a rain barn / greenhouse defender on top of it for snow, was absolutely pancaked to the ground by a cedar in this year's Snowmageddon event. So I no longer have a greenhouse. And I need to think about where I'm going to be starting seeds. You can also start things right in the ground. You just have less control over the conditions. And often you want to start things, get a jump on a season, which you can do in a sunny window perhaps, when you otherwise can't, in spring, for instance. Or you can actually, some seeds would rather be cool than hot, right? They want to germinate when it's starting to be on a cooling trend. So you can start things in the shade that you're otherwise going to sight in the sun if it's too hot out. So seeds need light once they've germinated. These are stretchy, not well lit tomato seedlings, so they're too long. You want to give them a lot of light so they have sort of stout stems like that. I mean, that's a much better looking tomato in this case, but except for those ones in the back, I don't know what's going on with them. Or speedling. I like to use speedling trays if you can get them. They're more like a nursery thing, but you can find them online or in shops, and they make these cool four-sided pyramid plugs. They're really easy to plant. This is sorrel, French sorrel, which is surprisingly very, very much like spinach in its bite and mouthfeel, but super lemony or sour, and really pretty drought resistant, oddly, for the way that the leaf is. And let's talk about pests. So pests, you're going to have pests. You probably recognize this pest because everybody in the county has it, or if you've ever gardened, you're going to get aphids. These are aphids on a late stage mustard. That mustard's beyond its prime as a leaf plant because it's in full bloom. So, but ideally you get to, you solve these problems. IPM, integrated pest management, is about identifying problems and solving them before they become tragedies, basically. So ideally you don't wait until your plants are this infested. You have been using IPM strategies, which have to do with preventing, right? Keeping plants healthy. That means good water, good soil, good conditions, planting the right plants at the right time, etc. Right? So a healthy plant is better able to resist or survive an infestation. And then when you have a problem, really identifying what it is and knowing, and master gardeners can help you do that. You can call, you can look at the pest notes, which we'll have at the end of the presentation or in the chat, and really try to understand what it is. In the old days, right, it was just broad spectrum insecticide, just spray everything with bug killer, right? And so that IPM is really kind of not about that. It's being more strategic and making better decisions based on keeping plants healthy. So knowing that these are aphids, and knowing that because, well, you've ever seen an aphid, you know what an aphid is. But knowing that the best control or way to deal with aphids is just to spray water on them and wash them away. And they'll drown or they won't be able to climb back up. But you have to keep doing that, right? So because you're going to miss one or two and they're going to breed. And then so knowing that that is the best solution and the easiest solution and cheap, and then adopting these strategies of mechanical control. So that's excluding picking, right? So if you have hornworms on your tomatoes, you pick them off and feed them to the blue jays, or excuse me, the stellar jays or the other jays. Accepting damage, right? Take a deep breath. Most of us aren't doing this because the success of that one tomato plant is going to make or break us for the year. You might be, and so you might have a different way of approaching it. But knowing that some of your leaves are going to get chewed and some of your fruit is going to be ugly, so to speak, and just dealing with it and cutting off the bad parts. And then if you must use insecticides and other things, using the right ones, using less toxic alternatives, using insecticidal soap, which is just super benign, or BT, and then following directions if you are going to use chemicals, following directions about when to apply them, how long you have to wait to harvest, really understanding how toxic they are, whether you have to wear gloves, etc. And so ideally, if you do all those other things, you won't get to that point. Carolyn Stromberg, who helped develop the chart and with whom I used to teach, may she rest in peace, used to say the best insecticide is the gardener's shadow. And so if you're spending time in your garden and you're looking at your plants and you're noticing when they look sad and catching these things before they get tragic, you're going to have a better overall success. And knowing that this kind of damage, this could be lots of things. It could be worms, right? Caterpillars, moth and butterfly larvae, or it could be finches, right? Lesser goldfinch or goldfinches who do this and will skeletonize leaves. And so how you deal with one is different than how you might deal with the other. Exclusion here is, trying to keep the rats out of the strawberries, which, by the way, this kind of bird netting isn't going to do. So just, pardon me, I'm going to cough. It's understanding the pest, understanding and sometimes going to heroic measures. This is my blueberry patch. The wire on the outside kept out the grosbeaks, but didn't keep out the finches. So I had to put another layer of wire in to keep the finches out. And if I wanted blueberries, and it was worth it to me to do that because I love blueberries. But everyone always asks this question, so I will just say, you'll see lots of folk remedies and hair and egg whites and coyote urine, etc. And deer plants that deer favor less, but they'll eat anything pretty much. And the only way to really exclude them is tall fences. And even then, they'll eat walnuts. Walnuts are like notoriously toxic and allelopathic and gnarly, the leaves and so forth, but deer will get a mind to eat them. You might have bears. Bears were coming into my garden to get the compost and the rabbit food, not the rabbits themselves, but the rabbit food. So you might have some unique challenges that you just have to work around. You solve the problem by trying, and by encouraging ecosystems like this. So here's a ladybird beetle on that mustard, eating the aphids and ideally laying eggs so that the larval stage of the ladybugs or ladybird beetles will eat those larvae. And you want to see bees in your garden, right? And you want to encourage these kind of ecosystem approaches to the thing as a whole system, from the soil and the subsoil on up to the plants. And you want snakes in your garden eating the meadow voles. And you might not want snakes in your. I'm not a huge fan, but this king snake was incredible. You want foxes because they eat stuff. So we're going to pause and take a 7-minute bio break, and feel free to put stuff in the chat. We can look at that. I'm going to mute. All right. So now we're going to talk about that. That's all that stuff. And again, that was a wall of information. So don't get stressed by any of that. Because there's a million ways for you to kind of slow down and get the information and get specific questions answered. And the master gardeners have great resources, including, I'm reaching back there, you won't be able to see it anyway, but the heavy tome of the Master Gardener Handbook is something that, you know, civilians can get a hold of. And it has basically all this information in greater detail, the Master Gardeners themselves. I'll let you know a little secret. Master Gardeners love to talk about gardening, as you might imagine. So bend the ear of a Master Gardener and they will bend yours back. And now part two. So here's what we're talking about, right? We're talking about things that we're seeding and planting now and expecting to eat in November and beyond. And if you'll notice from this, which has Brussels sprouts and rutabagas and Savoy cabbage, these are not typically the seeding bodies, right? So I mentioned that earlier, with the exception of peas and fava beans. These are mostly the leaves and immature flowers and the roots and those kinds of things. So that's more what we're talking about when we're talking about fall and winter vegetables. So let's just dive right in. Oh, we talked about this. I think this is in this, there's a link in the chat for the veggie guide, but you ought to get yourself one, in my opinion. So we're going to talk about leaf crops and cole crops and root crops and legumes and alliums and perennials. We talk about perennials here because perennials are things that you plant and expect to harvest for many years, right? They're not as opposed to annuals, which are the things we're mostly talking about. And perennials, they fit into this class because they start to become available whenever bare root trees are available, which is usually, I think, December and into early spring or late winter, early spring. So we're talking about artichokes and rhubarb and asparagus crowns and horseradish and even strawberries and those things. They'll often be in bins wherever you go to, wherever bare root trees are sold, you'll see bins full of sawdust or sand, and they will have these other things. And you plant them, you prepare. Ideally, right now you're preparing a bed for, say, asparagus, right? Because you don't want to work in soil when it's wet and soggy, you'll compact it, and it's not a good idea. So be thinking now, like, okay, I'm going to put in an asparagus bed for the next, and it's going to produce asparagus in 3 years for me for the next 15 years. So pick a good spot, make sure the soil's really good, start working it now. And then in December, get your crowns, plant them. And so that's why we talk about them here and now. That's a pea. Peas are a legume, right? So they do that nitrogen fixing trick. And peas are the cool season legume, right? Beans are the full summer legume that we plant, you know, in and amongst the corn or at the same time as the tomatoes. So let's talk about leaf plants that produce leaves, you know, lettuce, chard, etc. Most plants, I'm going to repeat this a lot, most plants like a loose soil with lots of good organic material, right? And that's just sort of an obvious thing. Most plants don't really like to be planted into heavy clays or overly sandy soils. We talk about sowing. So leaf crops often have small seeds, and small seeded plants, sometimes you just sort of just scatter and scratch the seeds if you're planting direct, right? If you're buying a 6-pack, that doesn't apply. And if you're planting into a 6-pack, it doesn't apply. But you can direct sow things like lettuce by just casting seed out and sort of scratching it in. And that's because the seed, that's how the plant would do it, right? If you think about it, if you've ever seen a lettuce plant, they make big, beautiful flower heads full of sort of silky, not silky, but like, what's the right word? Anyway, it doesn't matter. Small seeds that sort of just land on the ground and then germinate when they think it's right. But that goes along with thinning, right? So thinning is, I'll say, is about, think about how big the final plant is. And then you want the next one to be sort of overlapping, or not overlapping, but just slightly touching, right? You don't want the plants to be overlapping a lot in general, right? Because then they'll strive to, in the case of lettuce, they'll strive to make seeds and outcompete their next door neighbor. But generally plants want to have enough space for them to grow, but they don't mind being right up next to their neighbor as long as they're not sort of crowded and overlapping. So you can use a seed packet to give you an idea what that is. The seed packets will always tell you a spacing that is much larger than plants can actually, you can space things often quite a lot closer, but it's in the seed company's interest to sell you like a lot of seeds, right? So and then a lot of plants, lettuce in particular, if you thin it, you can eat those, right? You're eating baby lettuce and it's very gourmet. Fertilizing, so plants, looping back to fertilizers, leaves, nitrogen fertilizers, right? Plants that want to make leaves like nitrogen. And so using a liquid fertilizer and an organic fertilizer, but a balance like a 3-3-3, or scratching fertilizer into the soil on the sides of the plants where the water will then kind of carry it down to the roots. These leaf crops generally have sort of roots that are up at the top of the soil, right? Not necessarily, like a big tomato plant might have them down at 18 inches, but these plants are generally pretty small and they have their roots. So the point of that is even, consistent watering. You don't want the plant to think it's a feast or famine in terms of water, right? So don't let it dry out all the way and then soak it and saturate it and then let it dry out. Just kind of keep it consistent and even. When the top of the soil has just dried out, you can water again. A lot of these plants, chard, lettuce, those kinds of things, you don't have to take the whole plant out. You can cut a third of the leaves, the outside leaves or the oldest leaves from each plant, and you can make a nice salad that way. The plant will continue to grow, and so you can continue to just harvest by scissor rather than cutting the whole thing down. And problems, plants, in general, what we're talking about here is moths, right? So moths, Asian cabbage moths and other kinds of moths will lay eggs, and you'll get caterpillars or larval moths or larval butterflies eating holes in your leaves. White flies, there's some particular things we'll go over. Again, mostly the solution to that might be BT, Bacillus thuringiensis, or it might be putting floating row covers over things, or it might be safer soap or other kinds of insecticidal soaps. So let's talk about lettuce. And on the chart, if I look upon my chart, I see lettuce as a August to September seeding, right? Lettuce is again, you can find it in 6-packs, but you can also buy a package of lettuce seeds and just scatter them in a particular plot. This is a mix, so at the end of the season, I usually take my oldest seeds from my little seed boxes and stuff and mix the lettuce together and just cast it out to see what germinates. So in here is red oak leaf and black-seeded Simpson and troutback and bunch of different kinds of lettuce, and you can harvest each one of those little ones and have a gourmet lettuce salad while letting other ones get big and grow. Lettuce comes in kind of 4 forms: loose head, often called bib or butterhead lettuce; loose leaf, romaine, which is the kind of tall, skinny one with the crispy ribs or petioles. That's often used in a Caesar salad; and crisp head, which is not, there aren't really any great varieties for the home gardener, although someone can absolutely prove me wrong and say they have successfully grown iceberg lettuce in their garden. But generally speaking, if you've never grown lettuce before, choose a loose leaf lettuce and cast some into the ground and stir it in a little bit, scratch it in, water it, and see what happens. And you'll have lots of varieties that you can try. So in the loose leaf, I would try red oak leaf and black-seeded Simpson, and I like to grow one called Thai green. Notice I don't have a suggestion for a crisp head here because it's not really viable for El Dorado County gardeners. But just try something, or get a 6-pack. You might be able to find 6-packs. I haven't actually been to I've been on the trail, so I haven't been to a nursery, so I'm not sure what, and maybe someone who has might add in the chat. Are you starting to see fall and winter stuff appearing on nursery racks? I just don't know right now. Then if you want to try romaine, Paris Island Co's is a old school variety. It's been around in seed catalogs for a long time, and is a good, reliable place to start. You can, by the way, this is what happens. So you can grow lettuce in a couple of different seasons. Ideally, the lettuce you're planting now, we're going to get cool, right? Because what happens to lettuce is, it might be a daylight trigger, and it might be a temperature trigger. I can't quite recall. But anyway, what happens to lettuce if it's grown in the wrong season, or if it does this to you, just try a different variety, is it bolts. And so it'll start to elongate and send out a flower stalk. This is what the flower stalk looks like. And by that time, the lettuce itself becomes super bitter and it's inedible. So, I mean, chickens will eat it and you can compost it. But if you try to grow lettuce in a hotter season, right, a spring into summer, the minute it gets super hot, it bolts. So Probably better as a fall and winter crop. Not much else to say about it. Pretty easy to grow. Spinach. So spinach is one of the October plant things. And I'm kind of jumping ahead on the calendar here, but spinach you can seed in October, the middle of October, and then you'll expect to get it. It'll go through the winter, and you'll expect to start eating it in, say, late February, early March. Also, sort of prone to bolting, and you might have to hunt around for the variety of spinach that works really well for you. There's one called Indian Summer that has been pretty successful for me. But you may have your own varieties. But again, sort of similar culturally, plant it, keep it evenly watered. If it stretches out and bolts, that just means that you either planted it a little too early or a little too late in your particular thing, or you have a variety that's prone to doing that. Note that on your notes for this year and try a different one next year. Chard, which when I was a kid was Swiss chard, but now it's just chard. I keep meaning to look at the reason that is, but it's neither here nor there. Chard's really easy to grow. It's actually Beta vulgaris, or Beta vulgaris. It's the same plant as the beet, but just grown for the tops in particular. And really good for you, I think. Sort of anything that's like dark red or dark blue is probably pretty good for you. But super simple to grow. And I think it's actually a biennial. That might mean something to you, it might not. But anyway, you can get chard in 6-packs. You can get it and start it from seeds. It has a slightly bigger seed than lettuce. Fort Hook Giant is sort of the classic variety. Rhubarb chard is what you see here. Actually, you see rhubarb in the foreground and Fort Hook Giant in the back, which is more of a green and white chard. And then it's fun to grow, although many master gardeners don't think it tastes very good. But they make that sort of neon. You can buy those sort of bright lights or those neon. They're sort of neon orange and safety cone orange colors. So if nothing else, they look good in the garden. But again, not too much there. Pretty rugged plant. Doesn't need a lot, and can give you a good stir fry, and can be added in a salad when it's a little bit younger, so it's not so tough. Can be interplanted. This one is, yeah, that's just a picture of some healthy looking chard to me. And sometimes I'll do the same thing with chard and other greens. So this is chards and mustard sort of intermingled, just because I probably took a handful of seeds and threw them in a particular patch or plot and watered them, and they decided which ones are still viable if they were old seeds. So yeah, that's is that a beet? Or well, it's the same thing. So if you look at it, chard, when you leave it in the ground, it actually makes like a beet-like structure because it is a beet plant. But the ones that you buy as chard, that structure is going to be woody and not sweet and delicious. So, but it looks the same and is the same. So that's just kind of things for leaves. And then let's talk about the cool crops or brassicas. And this is a whole family of plants, and they're all cousins and cousin plants or varieties of the same thing. But here we're talking about Brussels sprouts and cabbages and broccolis and cauliflowers. And they all kind of get treated the same. Some are more difficult, in my opinion, to grow than others because of what you're expecting, and we'll talk about that. Cruciferous vegetables is the old school name, or maybe it's not old school, but it's, notice the flower has a cross form. So cruciferae from cross-shaped flowers. That's a broccoli or any one of these plants. They all sort of look the same eventually in flower. So if that was broccoli, that's you've waited a little too. I have waited. It's my picture. I have waited a little too late to harvest it. But they're all sort of kind of the same plant, although grown for different things. So broccoli grown for the immature flower heads, right? Brussels sprouts for the buds, cabbage for the leaves or the heads, usually cauliflower for the flowers, collards for the leaves. And then I encourage you to look at various kinds of Asian vegetables in these families. Some of the mustards in particular are really hardy plants and very successful in my garden. And they don't all have that strong mustard flavor, although some do. And if you like that, you can select ones for that. And then kale, again, and kohlrabi or kohlrabs, which are fun to grow. And then you find all these fun crosses of broccolinis and broccoli flowers and those kinds of things. So if you like this family of plants, then you should feel free to experiment with like lots of different kinds, and you will likely be very successful. The family includes canola, right, and rutabaga and turnips and all sorts of things, bok choys, and most of the things identified as Asian or stir-fried vegetables. This is a cauliflower, which I think is the harder. I believe Brussels sprouts. I've grown them, tried to grow them once. I don't think they're not growable by me. Or well, I tried once, but if you think about it, right, if you're expecting the plant to make leaves, if it's going to be a plant, most plants make leaves. So if you're growing kale or cabbage, an open-headed cabbage for the leaves, if the plant is successful at all, then you are successful, meaning you'll be able to get some leaves and eat them. If you're expecting the plant to grow both leaves and then make a beautiful flower, as in the case of a cauliflower, you know, it might be a little more difficult. And I think cauliflower is like really hard to grow. This is probably a cauliflower cross, or I'll show you. Next slide or something. I have like my biggest, best cauliflower, which is not very big, but I felt proud. They like rich, deep soil, right? These plants can get really big. A big cabbage, if you're growing it correctly, can be, you know, as I'm holding my arms out in a big hoop, but they can be very large plants. You'll want to look for ones that mature quickly, right? Or ones that have early in the name. And you'll know that on seed packets. You might not know it if you buy them in 6-packs, but the good nurseries will probably have ones that are early. Because you want to put these in the ground now, right? Or pretty soon from now, and then you're going to want to be eating them in November, and November is not very far away, right? So that's like a 3-month, more or less a 3-month maturation, 60 to 90 days. The reason the best time is fall. You can grow these as a spring crop. It's true for most of these things, but in the spring you have many more problems with aphids and cabbage moths, right? In the fall, those things tend to calm down. And then you can fertilize with side dressing. So scratching fertilizers, if you're going in rows, into the sides where some of those feeder roots are going to be able to pick that up when they get watered. Broccoli, though, is fun to grow, and certain kinds of broccoli are pretty easy to grow. Here's where, in the IPM sense, if you take a deep breath or lower your expectations, let's say. So you might not be growing, because broccoli, let's face it, is not grown commercially, I don't think, in El Dorado County. It's grown in places that have marine influence, right? Inland valleys and coastal valleys where things are a little cooler. So if you're expecting to grow, you know, a basketball size head of broccoli, you might be disappointed. But if you get a softball sized broccoli, you should feel very proud of yourself. And so choose early varieties. And that's especially true if you're planting in spring. That's mostly because you want to get them in and out before the aphids get crazy. Row covers I mentioned here, but floating row covers, it's a lightweight material that you can lay on top of a row of crops, let's say. It's a spun, I don't know what the material is, maybe polyester or whatever it is. It's a spun fabric-y product that's super light enough to just lay right on the plants, and they will grow up under it, and it kind of keeps moths and other things from flying onto them. And then calabrese is if you're going to grow one broccoli and you've never done it, try that one. It grows a central head, and in fact, this is a picture of one. Central head might be as big as a baseball or a softball, and then it's a resprouting broccoli. So if you cut that head off, you'll get sort of one broccoli floret at each of the nodes where the leaves meet the stems, and so you can kind of harvest over a longer period of time and feel successful having grown broccoli. This is one of the only photos that I didn't take, but I just think it's too beautiful. Oh, I have one like that, but it's fractals, right? It's a Mandelbrot set or a Julia set. It's a incredibly beautiful, I think, natural form of the flowers. Cauliflower I talked about. This is my most successful cauliflower I've ever grown, and it was about the size of a softball. And I did all the things like so it will start to go green if you leave it exposed to sun. So as it's maturing, you can kind of gently fold the leaves over it to keep the sun off of it, and maybe secure those with a rubber band if you need to. But again, you're expecting it to do a thing more than just making a plant. You're expecting it to make a plant and a flower. So you may have to find a good spot or the right time or the right variety that's going to work in your particular garden conditions. And I'll be honest, when I garden and it's a lot of effort to get a cauliflower, I usually just move on and grow more mustards or kales or things that are just a little less fussy. And then every few years, then I go back to it and like, oh, maybe this year I'm going to get the perfect cauliflowers. That's just how I garden. Start with the leaves; they're easier. Or start with kohlrabi because it's one of the best plants. So this is you eat the fattened stem there, and it's like a big apple made out of the inside of a broccoli stem, the real tender part, and just fantastic. They come in red and green and other varieties. They're affected by all the same pests and diseases of this whole family. So typically aphids and cabbage moths, but they're fun and delicious to grow. And you can eat the leaves. Like a lot of these plants, the leaves are sort of interchangeable in some ways. So collard greens, you can eat broccoli leaves. They might be tougher than you're accustomed to, but they have some of that same flavor, which you either like or you don't. Kale, though. Kale and mustards, right? If you're going to start and you've never done it before, I'd start with kales and mustards. Kales come in crinkly or Savoy varieties like this, and they come in smooth varieties, and they're rugged. There's like a super crinkly kale. Just super rugged plants, really pretty easy to grow. You have to like kale, but if you do, then I would encourage you to plant different kinds of kale. Really good for you. And there are perennial kales. This is a perennial kale. If you go to the Mendocino headlands, there are escaped kales all on the headlands there that escaped from Chinese gardens, cooking gardens or kitchen gardens in town. And these perennial kales will grow really tall and have tough leaves, but they're pretty drought resistant. And these are just out in the forest. You can see a seedling oak there. So you can get some perennial kales. You can buy seeds, or you can find them in different places. But it's kind of a neat plant. Walking stick kale isn't often called that because they grow this big tall stem and then sort of fall over and make leaves. There's one right there. So in this photo, if it's resolved for you, is a perennial kale. Comes back every year and makes these long, crazy. That's probably a 6 or 7 foot stem there. And then collards, similarly, really easy to grow. This is a greasy collard. And in fact, this, if you look, I can tell this is a collard in the summer. You can grow collards as a fall and winter or as a spring and summer because they're very resistant to bolting. They're not bothered so much by hot weather. If you think about, this is a greasy collard, so it has kind of a waxy leaf, and you can see some damage from caterpillars in the lower right-hand corner, but it's intermingled here with a scarlet runner bean or something. So that's how I know it's a spring summer. But again, you don't have to harvest that whole thing, right? You can take the oldest leaves, say a third from every plant, and you have a bunch of collards, which you can, just saute in a pan with some garlic and away you go. Same with mustard. So this is a giant red mustard that I grow every year. I like the strong mustard flavor, and it's a rugged diehard of a plant. And this is bald head mustard. This is a thing I grew 2 years ago as a new thing, something I had never grown, which created both leaves that were edible and then a kind of a radish-like structure there at the bottom. So it's kind of a fun dual-use plant. There are also lost the thought. So cabbage, again, there are cabbages that are grown sort of as loose-headed or leaved cabbage, and then ones that take a much more headed form. I trend towards the ones that are just loose leafy ones because they're easier, in my opinion, to grow. And sometimes if the plant is making like a structure like a cabbage, if some aphids get into the inner leaves and stuff, you don't know it until you cut it open and half of it's eaten by worms or whatever. So I kind of like to be able to see. But the point of this photo is that you can see this looks just like a broccoli or anything else, right? These are all more or less the same plant and grow in more or less the same habit. So things that we're growing for roots. And here we're talking mostly about carrots and turnips and radishes, right? soil is important because, right, the piece you want or the thing you want out of these plants is down below the soil. So if your soil is compact or has a lot of rocks, or you're going to be less successful. And so you want a soil that's loose and that can accommodate the growth of these subsoil structures. Carrots take forever. Someone mentioned carrots for Santa's reindeer, and that's absolutely right. Carrots take forever. We're seeding them in August, and we're not eating till December, and they're very slow growing. And they're you kind of sometimes have to mark the rows in ways that you knew you planted carrots there, because sometimes they take forever. But and with carrots, the variety is really important. You're generally looking for carrots in like a 6 to 8 inch range carrot, so that because carrots come in like giant long varieties and stuff, but those take a really long time and you have to have really deep soil. So I think I have a carrot chart in here. Thinning is important, right? And so I mentioned thinning. You want the plants, I don't know if you can see my hands, but you want them to be sort of their final crown or form to be more or less like almost touching. In the case of plants we're going for roots, you got to think about what's happening below the surface. So you don't want them crowding together below the surface. And so just think about that when you are when you're planting, and be ruthless in your thinning, I would say, which is really hard, right? Because I hate, taking out young carrots, but you'll be more successful and have maybe fewer but better carrots than you would otherwise have. Pests of roots, there are some worms and things that will get into the kind of James and the Giant Peach hole, the carrots. Usually you can just cut that part out. The carrot will, carrot won't care, and you just don't eat the bad part. Carrots have, that's picture of carrot foliage by what do you call it when the moon goes, shadow of the moon goes across the sun? I'm sorry, words are failing me this morning. Doesn't matter. Thank you. The eclipse. That was just a carrot. The eclipse was happening and it was making neat shadows on the carrots. So there's some carrots. You can successfully grow carrots. Shorter varieties are better. Tapered carrots are easier to pull. This is why soil is important, right? That carrot bumped into something, a rock or a piece of wood, and grew around it. So again, that doesn't really matter. I can eat that carrot, but if you want them to be long and perfectly straight, then make sure your soil's deep. And right around Nantes and Danver, which are sort of mid chart here, or 6 inch, 7 inch carrots are good choices, and shorter, right? You can get little round carrots and fun. There's lots of fun kinds of carrots in different colors and formats in the 6 inch and shorter range. So, but these root things are things you generally want to start from seed in place, right? You really don't want to disturb the roots by transplanting them, although it is possible. But carrots, you probably want to buy them from seed. I don't think you can buy 6 packs of carrots, but you want to seed them in place, and then keep them well watered, and have them grow where you put them. And turnips. Turnips are fun to grow because they're also pretty easy. And turnip greens, you can get varieties that are specifically seed packets that specifically say the tops are tender, and as are the other structures. And then radishes, easy to grow. You can mix radish seeds and carrot seeds and sow them all at once. The radishes will come up long before the carrots or be mature. And as you're pulling out the radishes to eat them, you're thinning the carrots. So they're often good to interplant with carrots as a just scattered seed. There are radishes, you can look for ones that say they're specifically tender on top. And then radishes are nicely grown in this season because heat, they end up being real either pithy or very, very sort of strongly radish flavored when they get a lot of heat. But easy to grow. And then you can look for kind of obscure varietals. Black Spanish is a winter radish, so there are radishes that are meant to grow and like keeping radishes. And this one, dragon's tongue, is a podding radish. All radishes will make pods, but this one in particular is grown for that more than it is for the radish part. And these pods, when picked earlier, are a nice tender addition to a stir fry or a salad, and have a little hint of that kind of radish heat, but are very tender. So look for podding radish is the kind of term that is, podding with a D is a term that is often used for those. We're on to peas. Peas are an October plant, meaning you're seeding in October, and you're direct seeding typically right into a garden bed. And peas, they come in all different, sort of, there's podding, there's sugar snap peas, and there's podding peas, and the kind of peas that you have to peel and process, and so there's all different variety of peas. They often have Oregon in the name, and all the Oregon, anything with Oregon in the name works really well in my garden. As I mentioned, my garden's in the same garden zone as parts of Oregon, so you can plant them in October. You can plant them in a cool spring. Again, looking for the word early or germination or time to harvest in the kind of 60, 90, 110 day range. Pre-sprouting, so you can take peas and soak them and wait till the radicle, the little root that is the baby root, looks like it's sort of coming to life, and plant them that way. Sometimes you want to do that because if you plant peas into cold, wet soil, that's more a problem in the spring. They might rot before they germinate, right? So if you soak them or pre-soak them or pre-germ them, they are already, the metabolic processes that say get ready to make a plant are already in play, and they'll be more likely to be successful. Peas get powdery mildew on the leaves. Birds and squirrels love them. Aphids love them. So you may have to protect them with nets or row covers. And in the case of aphids, that's why October might be a better time to try peas. But not much else to say. They require support usually. You want to keep them up. Peas are about the only fall and winter thing. You want to keep them up. So if they're in the soil and they're wet, if they're laying on the soil and they're wet a lot, you can have some problems of leaf diseases. So you'll want to give them some structure to kind of stand up on or support them. And fava beans are really fun to grow if you like fava beans. They make big, sturdy plants. You can grow them as a cover crop as well. They make a lot of beans per plant. And they require a little bit more post-processing. So once you take them out of their main shell, they look like this, and you blanch them. There's like a leathery covering on the outside of that seed there, and you blanch them and then slip them out of that, and then you get fava beans, and you can do with them what you will. This is a really small variety. You've probably seen the ones that make big, like 2 on a plate fava beans. I grow typically these smaller ones and then use them in a walnut fava bean, mash that stuff together, and it makes a great spread for toast. Garlic, olive oil, walnut, fava bean, salt, and pepper. Just delicious. And then, sorry, I'm looking at the time. Just make sure we're on track. We are. Alliums. So things in the onion family. There's a bee on some beautiful, really interesting family of plants. There's lots of them. There's ornamental ones that you eat. Bees like the thing. There's wild ones. This is up in Desolation, up in the rock-bound area, and that's just a field of wild onions intermixed with, I think, tiger lilies. You can smell them a mile away. But in this family are onions, garlic, leeks, and shallots. There's actually wild onions all over the Sierra. So this is Cottonwood Lakes area, or approaching Old Army Pass. And they're fun because you're around the corner, you can sometimes smell that there's an onion patch around. Onions themselves, someone mentioned in the chat that they were unsuccessful, and so onions come in stronger American and milder European varieties, and each of those is red, white, and yellow. The mild ones tend to be sweeter and smaller. The American kind of strong American onions have that real strong oniony presence. And then also bunching varieties, old school multiplier potato varieties, which have a habit much like shallots. And then top setting onions, Egyptian walking onions, will form bulbils at the tops of long stalks and fall over and root and sort of walk in that sense. So you're looking for long day or intermediate day onions. If you're planting in the fall, look for intermediate day. If you're planting in spring, look for long day. Those are the words they say. And basically onions are triggered to bulb based on day length. Here's an old picture of onions in my garden where I planted them too close together, right? So you can see that there's onions competing to grow bulbs here. So again, one of the reasons I document is to figure out what I did wrong last time and try and do better this time. So this is a document of my, that's just an onion in the compost where the bottom part, the chef's mustache, as it's called, is up, its roots up, and it still wants to grow. Don't grow onions from the varieties you buy in the store. They're not the right kind typically for our county, or they're not the right kind for, they're designed or selected for mechanized agriculture and field growth. So look for either seeds or 6 packs of onions that you get at a nursery. And you can take a 6-pack of, if you buy a 6-pack of intermediate day onions and it looks like grass, you can tease that apart with a hard water spray and a plastic fork or whatever. They're actually pretty rugged, the roots are. And so from a 6-pack, you can get many row feet of onions and, you know, plant them, whatever, a few inches apart or a hand's width apart. And you can get a whole bunch of onions out of a 6-pack of onion, or get them from seed. Garlic. Garlic is what I wish every gardener, I mean, if you like garlic, I wish every gardener would grow. It's the easy, to my mind, the easiest and most satisfying garden crop there is in El Dorado County as an October planted thing. And every year I get garlic like this, and it's so satisfying, and really a worry-free crop. Garlic comes in hardneck and softneck varieties. Garlic is planted in October and will sit quite handily through snow in Georgetown. It's not bothered by that. Here is again another picture where this garlic is way too far apart. Like, garlic doesn't need to be spaced in rows a foot apart like that, and can be much more densely planted, as in this example. Although in this example, I planted it right in the middle of the garden and had to work around it for the getting ready for the next season because it wasn't done when everything else was done. And this looks more like the kind of plant spacing that I use now, where basically each kind of full head of garlic is going to be not quite touching its neighbor, but not super far away either. I use the sticks to designate different varieties. So I'll plant a big block of one thing and then just drag a stick across and plant the next variety after that. And now that I'm in raised beds, I reserve one whole raised bed, which is more or less 4 by 8 for garlic every year. So I have that bed, and that bed rotates. So every year, right now, that bed has buckwheat in it, which I will chop down and till into the soil coming up here, at least 2 weeks before planting the garlic into it. And plant the garlic in October, and then expect to harvest it, you know, around 4th of July or somewhere in there. And then the joy of planting garlic, and especially hardneck garlic. So garlic you can buy as a hardneck or a softneck. A hardneck garlic has a central woody stem and has between, say, 5 and 6 or 5 and 8 big definitive cloves, as opposed to a softneck garlic, which is more like the braiding garlics or the Italian kinds of garlics that has lots of little cloves of different sizes, right? And no central stem. But garlic scapes, which are the flowering body of the plant, and each plant, I plant almost exclusively hardneck garlics, and each plant produces one garlic scape, which is the flower. And if you harvest it right at this time before it actually flowers. It's a wonderful gourmet treat. It has the bite or mouthfeel of asparagus, but with the flavor of garlic, and can be just you cut off sort of the flowery end, which gets a little woody, and you saute it up really in just a little olive oil, and it makes its own kind of really a wonderful stir fry, or it's a pickled product. Or I made lately, I've been doing pesto. So garlic scape pesto is chef's kiss. It's delicious. When you harvest garlic, so late in the season, garlic will start to look like, it just looks bedraggled, and it looks like it wants more water, but really right around after it flowers, and in June and July, it just starts to look bedraggled. And so once the stem kind of falls over, you stop watering it. You don't want to get a bunch of that black sooty mold on the outside papers, and you just kind of knock them down and harvest them, and then dry them out of the sun. So I kind of braid them together and hang them on the underside of an umbrella, like a garden umbrella like this, and then eventually cut off those greens once it's dried at the stem, and bring those in the house into a paper bag or a box, and keep them, in a closet, a cool, dark place. And saving, however, the fun thing about garlic is you don't have to buy it every year. You buy it once, and if you're good with it and save the best bulbs for next year, you just have garlic forever. And so you take that whole bulb there, and then you break that up into 6 cloves, and each one of those 6 cloves will make another bulb in the next season. And you typically, the hard part is you take the very best ones, like that's the best practice, right? Find the biggest, best ones and reserve those for planting in October the next season. And they will keep until October, right? And then you put those in the ground, and then you have garlic. Elephant garlic is actually a leek, but is also fun to grow. It has a much more mild flavor than some of these other garlics, and produces these giant kind of soft heads, and then also these interesting kind of escape pods on the side. Each one of those can be planted and again make a new plant, which will eventually produce big bulbs of elephant garlic. Shallots come in different varieties and are another sort of one. Here's a shallot where you plant one of those things and it produces a big cluster of them like this each season. Shallots are fun and delicious and a little harder to process, in my opinion, than garlic. And then they also come in these like 1 to 4, 1 to 5, which is much more like a habit of a hardneck garlic, but also fun and easy to grow. Shallots, there's a walking onion or a bulbil. So the tops of the flower stalks in this case produce these little sort of mini garlics or mini shallots or mini onions, and then those can be planted individually or will fall over and root themselves. I mentioned multiply onions just because they're fun. You'll have to find these in a catalog somewhere, but they're potato onions. They're onions, but they don't produce a single big round onion bulb. They produce kind of a couple of, or 3 or 4 in this case, more like shallot onions. So fun to grow and really hardy. These are just out in the woods at my house. And that's alliums. There's not much to say. You'll find garlic. You can buy it. You can buy it as cloves in October, November. Some cool nurseries will have it. Some won't, and you can find online sources for garlic, and it very often sells out. I will say this. So look for, if I were you, I'd start with a hardneck garlic, German giant, for instance, or and order it. If you can't find them on the shelf, order them early, because garlic tends to sell out at the good garlic suppliers. Talked about perennials. This is again our plants that you're putting in the ground and expect to harvest for the next 15 years or so. So artichokes, asparagus, rhubarb, Jerusalem sunchokes, Jerusalem artichoke, I would add to this category, and horseradish. Because phosphorus doesn't move very well in the soil, you just want to make sure you have good soil where you're putting them, right? Because you don't want to mess with them, and you want them to be happy in the ground for a long time. So pick a plot right now that you're going to put in an asparagus bed. Double the size of it in your mind, because asparagus takes a long time to actually harvest, 3 years or more, until it's ready to harvest. So you want to do more than you thought you wanted, because you want to have a lot of asparagus by the time you've waited 3 years. Artichokes, you'll find them either as crowns or in pots. I'm not real successful with artichokes. I know there are master gardeners that are, in particular some folks that live more on the American River kind of canyon. But I try every year. And if you think about where artichoke grow sort of naturally. I mean, thistles grow everywhere, but artichokes for commercial use are grown in, again, those valleys that have a marine influence and fog and those kinds of things. So El Dorado County, at least my part of it, is not like that. But again, artichokes in that family. I grow cardoon quite successfully. So cardoon or cardoni is an artichoke that is grown for the stalk, which is sort of a celery-like, the petiole or the leaf stalk is a celery-like in terms of its bite and mouthfeel, but it tastes like artichoke. And it produces these spiny, gnarly flowers that are not particularly useful as artichokes. But regular globe artichokes, I have a hard time growing. These I just like the picture of because I wish that my artichokes looked like this, and maybe yours do, and if so, huzzah to you. These are that way because they're being fed continually with giraffe and zebra manure. This is a Bee Brine Preserve in Point Arena. If you've never been, you should check it out. They let me take I mention this all the time because I'm so proud of it. They let me take a zebra manure because I was talking to the gardener there, and he's like, "Yeah, we just have endless zebra manure." I was like, "Can I get some of that in a bag?" So I had zebra manure added to my compost pile. Rhubarb, really easy to grow. Sometimes even the sort of it doesn't always come up red in my garden. Interestingly, I don't really know why. I could probably look that up, but it tastes the same and it doesn't matter. And you either like rhubarb or you don't, in my experience. But it's, again, a perennial that can be divided. Rhubarb is one where you can dig it up every couple of years and divide it. It makes a real gnarly subsurface structure that you can kind of cut into fours and divide and move rhubarb around, and it'll come back in those spots until you move it again. And rhubarb is one where you're using the leaf stalk and you have to cook it. It's got a lot of, I think, oxalic acid or something that would make you quite sick if you ate it in quantity without cooking it, but typically used as a sweet vegetable in a pie context or a cobbler kind of context. Makes a neat, you don't really want to let it do this generally, but it makes a neat leaf, a flower stalk, and the flowers produce seeds that are encased in like a little paper envelope. It's kind of fun to let it grow. But the king of this, or the queen of this, it actually is the best in my, or the most satisfying perennial vegetable is the asparagus plant. Here we have asparagus in its beautiful fall foliage, about to go dormant for the year. They all have you want generally male plants because statistically they'll produce more stalks. The female plants spend metabolic energy making berries. But so they have names like Jersey Knight and Jersey Giant, these sort of heroic male names, but you can buy them as seeds. It'll take you an extra year to get production, or you can buy them as roots or crowns. And again at bare root time, and it looks like a little, I have a picture one, but you plant them in trenches and you slowly fill in the trench as the plant grows up. The first year you don't do anything, you let it grow. The second year you might be able to pick a few, and the third year you might be able to pick a few more, and then in years 4 and beyond you can pick a lot more. But you'll always, with perennials generally, you don't want to pick the whole plant down to the ground because it needs to store energy for the next season. So with asparagus, you might harvest for a week and then you just let it grow and make a plant, and then it does all its thing and it'll die back, and each year you get to do that. The same is true for rhubarb or other things. You don't want to pick the whole thing down to the ground. You pick a few leaves from each plant every couple of days, but leave it some top growth to store energy for the coming dormant season and return to you. There's male and female plants. If you grow from seed, you don't know what you're going to get, right? So you might end up with male and female plants. And even if you get crowns, sometimes you don't get all male plants. And I've found it doesn't matter, not worry about it. And in fact, the berries that the females produce can get weedy. Asparagus can grow weedy so you might want to harvest those berries, or at least keep it mulched so it doesn't get like a weedy patch of asparagus. That's what the crowns look like. Again, they're around in the bare root season, so you can see when I planted this bed, there was snow on the ground. You dig a trench, you put it in, you bury it up to the little top part, and then as it's growing, you just sort of fill in that trench so that the crown itself is, say, 12 or some number of inches, 12 and beyond inches below the ground. and then just harvest it starting in year 4 and through. In my case, when I finally, it's really pretty drought tolerant, but in those drought years, I had not set up good irrigation for it, and it finally just sort of died out. So I had to make a new batch. But think about asparagus now, work a plot for it now, and then when you get the crowns in December and January, go ahead and put them in the ground. I mentioned, and these will be, I think, duplicated in the chat. The things that the resources master gardeners use are the VRIC stuff, which is there's a page essentially, or a document about every vegetable we've talked about. So there will be a vegetable asparagus for the home gardener, and you can go there and it will give you all the cultural practices and pests and problems and how to be successful with asparagus or tomatoes or peas or anything we've talked about today. The IPM website is strategies for using integrated pest management and how to approach keeping your garden healthy and dealing with things that happen. And Plant a Row, which we actually retired. I need to take that out. Don't look there. Look at the Master Gardener website. There's an effort in the county to provide surplus to soup kitchens and other places so that folks who need fresh vegetables can get them. Finally, I document my garden here. This is just a labor of love. I haven't updated it in a while, but if you're interested, foodforestgarden.org is where I take pictures of and talk about my own food forest and the other gardening and growing efforts that I do, in case that's of interest to you. And I think that is it. Thank you so much for your time and attention. I think we'll try to address some questions right now. But really, what I hope you walk away with is that you can do this, you'll be successful, and just go ahead and try some things, and then know that the master gardeners in the county have your back when you run into questions that you don't know how to answer or challenges. And I wish you all the success in your garden this year. And thanks to the other master gardeners who are here supporting this class, and thanks to all master gardeners and everyone who attended. What do you think?
Thank you, Zach. That was a wonderful class. I have just a couple things in the chat I want to follow up on. I think just for fun, everyone put your favorite pollinator plant into the chat. Zach shared his rosemary. It's an awesome, it's really popular. Everyone knows that plant, but it is a great pollinator. Someone else mentioned sabulas, great pollinator plants. Sunflowers. I am a nut for nasturtiums, cosmos, zinnias. Zinnias come in all sorts of shapes and sizes and types. Hyssop, borage. There's just so many great options. And then the other thing that someone had talked about that I wanted to have Zach just talk about a little bit is planting for she called it trap plants, letting maybe a spent kale plant go to flower and seed and draw aphids or maybe other pests to that plant so that they leave your other garden vegetables alone. So that is one integrated pest managed strategy. And I'd love for Zach, if you want to talk a little bit about that, but I think it's important to preface that is one piece of a bigger integrated pest management system that you're going to want to employ. So I really would caution, read up first about what is integrated pest management, and then think about how you incorporate trap plants into that, because it is a great strategy. But Zach, do you utilize that in your garden? And maybe just talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, sometimes. So the interesting thing is, right, so you'll hear a lot of what is the prime example? Marigolds, right? So you'll often read. Here's the interesting thing about sort of UC Master Gardener or whatever, right? So our goal is to disseminate research-based information, and some of these things haven't been studied, and some have, and some I mentioned solutions like hair for deer and whatever. Like those are I would call them folk remedies or folk cures, and some of those bear out and some of them don't. And so part of it's doing the research, as Tracy suggested. Part of it's direct observation, like the trap plant thing. Absolutely, no matter what, there are plants that aphids in my garden love more than other ones, and they tend to be mustards, right? And so if you know that, and no matter what you do, the aphids are going to go to the mustard, giving them some sacrificial mustards out at the edge of the garden can be a really great strategy. And if all the aphids are magnetized toward that, then that's a great strategy. And then I've also tried lots of, I just like anyone who's a gardener, like looks up everything, right, and reads everything. So I was always reading that marigolds are going to keep X, Y, or Z out of the garden. And so I was like, great, I'm going to plant marigolds. And marigolds became the host for, attracted every negative thing that I was trying to get out. And so some of it is your mileage may vary. Some of it's folk remedies that you try and they either prove to be true or not in your particular garden. And then some of them become things that that the UC researches and says definitively X, Y, or Z works or doesn't work. So I encourage you to try all those things. I encourage you to read everything you can about integrated pest management and think about a trap crop is like a really great way to think about your garden as an ecosystem. And if empirically things really want to go to this thing, then absolutely do the things that are going to keep them off of your other plants and attract them there. So it's super simple and it's super complex, right? What works for your eyes, if it works in your garden, absolutely do whatever it is. And then don't be surprised as I was, where when I tried the thing and it was absolutely the opposite effect. And then just research whatever you can, or talk to master gardeners, or come out to the demonstration garden, look at what the UC's researched, because they can't research everything, right? So there's certainly garden practices that people have been doing for millennia that are perhaps not well researched. That doesn't mean that they don't work, but it does mean that we don't necessarily talk about all those things in these presentations because we're presenting UC research stuff. I know that's a long and boring answer, but what I would say is do whatever works in your garden. And try things and then be prepared for them to work or not and adapt as necessary.
Perfect. Perfect. Is there any more questions in the chat? On the pesticide side, how can I protect my garden from pesticides used in my neighbor's garden?
That's a tough one. And it's, I mean, you see signs all over the place on the side of the road, no spray, right? And gardens that have drift or that are not using practices. And to me, if you have the kind of relationship with your neighbors that I do, you can invite them to your garden and talk about the things that you do and the why. And do the sort of subtle, like, what if the whole the whole block or the whole neighborhood thought about our garden as one big organism, right? And we're all trying to create pollinator. Let's get together and have a pollinator planting party, and let's think about our ecosystem, and then the zoom out one level. And if you don't have that kind of relationship or don't want to cultivate that, or what, I'm not saying you particularly, Natalie, I'm just saying in general. I know people have cranky neighbors. It's a tough one. I don't know that I don't know exactly how to address that, other than it's bad for all of us if someone is like killing pollinators, right? It's because they don't just stay in their garden, they stay in our garden, and they might have a forage range that's a square mile, or so that's a tough one. But it might be education, it might be leading by example, it might be yeah, I don't know if anyone else has wise ideas or experiences that they've been successful at. Add those to the chat too.
I love that, Zach, because what you're saying is be kind, get to know your neighbors, and invite them over and gently educate. That's not always an option. And another thing I was thinking of is, locate your garden. If you're lucky to have a neighbor on one side but not on the other, you might locate your garden on the farthest side from that neighbor who's spraying chemicals, or things like that. So not easy answers, but there's things you can do to minimize proximity of your garden to your neighbors. There is let's see, 2 more questions that we'll get to before we close. Something ate.
Like cutworms or something?
Something ate nearly an entire greenhouse of artichokes after Snowmageddon destroyed it, one by one, cut at the root. A critter.
Yeah, I mean, I immediately think of when ground squirrels emerge. I used to have ground squirrels and then they're gone now, but when they emerge they want greens in the spring and they want grains in the summer, right? When they're about to When they first wake up, they want to eat. And so they used to go down the rows. It sounds like that. It could be also cutworms and other things. But when the ground squirrels emerged in the spring, they would walk down the rows and eat at the soil level every single thing I had planted, 20 row feet of, broccoli or whatever. So that's the first thing I thought of. And then I thought of cutworms or other kinds of pests that will just chop things off right at the soil level and leave a brutal wake of destruction. Yeah, but I don't know. It is an ouch. I'm sorry, Audrey. It sounds terrible.
And we'll close with one last question, and that is, when buying young garlic for planting, is there a way to select for males only?
Botanically, I don't know that garlic. It's a good question. I don't know botanically whether actually garlic has male and female flowers or whether it has both on the same plant. But when I think about garlic, when you're buying it as just it looks like the bulb you would buy in a market. And in my experience, every one of those will always produce a flower, whether it's a female flower, male flower, I don't know. I'm not sure it matters at all. I'm not sure. I never thought about it before, and I was always happy that it made a flower. Because all the hardnecks will make a scape. So I'm not really sure how to answer that, other than what I would do is I would go to the VRIC, maybe look for the home gardener and see if actually male or female is a consideration for garlic, because I've never thought about it when I plant it. So I know it's a non-answer, but it's asparagus. Maybe that's it. Pat might have said. It might have been that I misspoke or that we're crossing wires here, but if the question actually was about asparagus, or that's where male female is kind of an issue, but it really isn't. You can't tell. When you buy seeds, you don't know. When you buy crowns, they say they'll all be male, but often you'll get a female, and it usually doesn't matter. At agricultural scales, it might statistically matter, right? The female plants might make 15% less asparagus spears over the lifetime of the field, but that's usually not a consideration for the home gardener. And so I don't even worry about it. I just think it's kind of neat to at least know in your asparagus patch, there's 2 female plants because they're the ones making red berries. So if it's that, okay. Thanks, Kathy. Confirmed. Yeah, no, you can't know. They'll always say, it's Jersey Giant, they're all males, but often they won't be, and it won't really matter statistically. So don't even worry about it. Plant whatever. And if you want, tear out the female plants, just so that you don't have a bunch of berries making asparagus weeds, but otherwise don't even worry about it because they make beautiful spears and it'll be fine.
Well, thank you very much, Zack. Welcome back to the real world. And we're so glad that you spent day 1 or 2 with us, teaching us about fall and winter gardening. And join me, folks, in a round of applause for Zack, for your time, for your expertise. And we just wish everyone a happy season of gardening this year. And if you need master gardeners, we're here to help you. Our email is mgeldorado@ucanr.edu, or you can call us on the telephone at 530-621-5512. You'll also see us out at your farmers markets and different community events, but we're here for you. Our services are free. Come out and see us at the demonstration garden. Have a great day and enjoy gardening. Take care.
Thanks, folks.